This is The Behavioral Divide, brought to you by Avantis Investors, where we bring together both academic research and real-world financial advice to uncover insights that may help us make better financial decisions. I am Jeremy Thornton with Avantis, here with our host, Professor Hal Hershfield. And Hal, it's great to be back. This time we're talking about empty nesters. What did you think about this episode, Hal?
Yeah, Jeremy, thank you. I know this is a topic that I haven't spent a ton of time thinking about with my kids being pretty young, but today we've got two really interesting guests with different perspectives on this transition. On the academic side, we've got Andrew Biggs. He's a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He studies all things retirement, Social Security reform, state and local government pensions, et cetera. He's also the author of a recently published book, The Real Retirement Crisis: Why Almost Everything You Know About the U.S. Retirement System is Wrong. And then on the advisor side, we've got Robin Sherwood. She's a CFP and principal at HTG Investment Advisors. A couple things really stood out to me because I definitely went in with some preconceived notions that I will admit were somewhat naive because I haven't thought a ton about this transition. But one big takeaway for me is that it's not a binary transition. Like I used to think, well, it happens when the kids leave the house. And of course, in both talking to Andrew and Robin, you realize that there's different ways to define what it means to become an empty nester. Is it when they leave? Is it when they're off the payroll, so to speak? And how does that happen? How long does it take to happen? And that has real implications for the spending outcomes, the saving outcomes, the psychological outcomes. And then to me, one of the other big takeaways here is that, you hear so much about the retirement crisis, but Andrew's data and research suggests one bright spot is that when kids leave, that does have some positive sort of beneficial impacts on retirement readiness and household spending and saving. And it's nuanced. It's not so black and white, but I think it's a pretty interesting positive point of view there.
Yeah. No, I thought the conversation was fascinating, maybe in part because, I'm still in the phase where all the kiddos are still at home. So sort of looking forward to some of the things that we talk about on the episode here. But I thought what I didn't quite expect was the degree to which Andrew kind of described that children leaving the home really helps with respect to retirement readiness. I think that's sort of intuitive, but I think it was a bigger point than I sort of anticipated coming into it. So, yeah, really excited for folks to also hear that. I think they'll find it interesting. So it was a great conversation.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's go to the episode.
I'm really looking forward to this. Andrew, Robin, thank you both so much for being here. My kids are 5 and 9, so becoming an empty nester feels far away, but I do know it's coming. And I'm really excited to dig in to talk about both the financial side of what happens when people make this transition to becoming an empty nester, as well as the psychological. Andrew, I do want to start with you. You've done some really fascinating research trying to isolate what does happen, especially on the financial side, when this transition occurs. And I'm wondering if you could just speak to this a bit. What are some of the financial outcomes that arise when people make the transition to becoming an empty nester? And if you feel comfortable, why might some of those outcomes occur?
Well, I mean, my research focuses on the adequacy of Americans' retirement savings. Yeah, you'll read in the newspaper, the Americans are not saving enough for retirement. We face a retirement crisis, so on and so forth. And when you hear headlines like that, people will focus on things like are enough Americans participating in 401ks? How long are we living? So on and so forth. When you actually dig through, the way these things are projected, the models that project, how well Americans are going to do in retirement, kids play this enormous role. And it's thinking about how household spending responds to children entering the home and children leaving the home. We know from data that when kids enter the home, that household spending starts to increase. And I don't have to refer to the data on this, just any parent knows, you have some stroller that costs as much as a small car and all these different things. And so household spending starts going up. The question for retirement savings adequacy is what happens when kids leave the nest? And there's two theories for that. One theory is that parents sort of take over the spending that was going to their kids. As kids, you don't need to pay for their car insurance or things like that. They leave the nest, become economically independent. One theory is parents start spending more on their own. And if that's the case, then they need to keep saving a lot so they can maintain that higher lifestyle in retirement. The second theory is that as kids leave home, become economically independent, living on their own, the household savings or household spending is going to decline. So you're going to see this hump shape in the spending patterns. And if you look at that assumption, then parents don't really need to boost their savings very much when kids leave home. That the key issue there is they just spend less. That parents spend less because a lot of their pre-retirement income goes to supporting their kids. A middle income couple could spend up to a third of their income on their kids: food, clothing, shelter, childcare, education. What my research has found is it's really the second explanation, the second model that really holds true. Household spending tends to peak in the late 40s, right when kids are sort of entering college. But then it declines. And so by age 65, the typical household with kids is spending about 15% less than it did when it was in its late 40s, adjusted for inflation. And the reduction of those spending are precisely the places you would expect. Less on transportation, less on childcare, less on education. It's clearly child related. And what that means is that parents are really entering retirement with a much lower level of spending than they had during the middle of their careers. What that means is it makes it easier for parents to maintain their standard of living than if we assumed parents kind of took over all the spending that was going on their kids. This assumption alone, if you think of studies that project, half of Americans may have inadequate incomes for retirement, simply changing your assumption on how things work with spending on kids reduces that share of unprepared or underprepared households by about 2/3. So this is something nobody pays attention to, but is really a major deal in how you think about how well Americans are prepared for retirement. Do we face a retirement crisis? So I think it's really good news and encouraging news.
Okay, this is fascinating because I agree with you that you hear a lot of headlines, and especially you couple the headlines about retirement preparedness with Social Security trust fund being depleted, and obviously there's some doom and gloom there, and there's probably some positive effects of that because it might mean that people are going to start saving a little bit more, thinking, or at least thinking about their spending and saving in intentional ways. Andrew, I want to come back to you in a second because one of the big questions I have is, where does that money go? If I'm spending less on some of the obvious categories, do I spend more on some other ones, or do things sort of just smooth out? But let me just seed that. Before I get there, I want to just hear from Robin, who's dealing with clients in their 50s, 60s, 70s who are making these transitions. And I guess one of the questions I have for you, Robin, is what strategies do you employ and when do you employ them to help your clients think through this? Largely, it's largely a financial transition that happens when they become empty nesters.
Great. Thanks for including me in this podcast. So, yeah, it's an interesting question. I would say that first of all, I guess I would start by saying, Andrew's dealing with big data. I'm dealing with individuals. We're counseling people. And so we're dealing with individual circumstances, which is always going to be a little different than broad swaths of data. And we are dealing with a lot of people who are gradually going through what I would call the empty nest transition. So, and the empty nest transition, I'm a little older than the rest of you. So the empty nest transition is a long one. It's not all of a sudden. It would be nice to think that your children will graduate from college and immediately get a job and they're off the payroll. I would say off the payroll is the thing that I hear the most from our clients as to when their children are really off the payroll and launched. And it's I think it's slower than it used to be. And so what we grapple with our clients is helping them to understand, what can they spend on their kids maybe after they're out of college. Um, and I'm wondering how that's captured in the data. Getting them started in the housing market, as you can imagine, is a very big deal. Helping them sort of get started, finding that first job, helping them with housing, and and other things, cell phone bills and the like. So we don't do anything terribly different with those with kids or without kids in that transition. We're always talking to our clients about their spending. And one of the first things that you have to deal with in terms of clients is, do they even know what they're spending? And for most people who are planners, who are thinking about the future, their financial future, um, one of their goals is very commonly to maintain their lifestyle. And I always say, well, you can't maintain something that you don't know what it is. So you'd be surprised how few people really can, you know, uh, quantify, identify what is their lifestyle. But we like a lot of financial planners, we use financial planning software that allows us to do a pretty detailed financial projection, and we're looking at their spending. We're making adjustments for the fact that yes, their children are going to be off the payroll someday. Weddings, down payments have to be added into their financial projections. The only thing I would say in response to what Andrew was saying is that um, we wouldn't project off of a 45-year-old. If we have a 55 or a 60-year-old we're planning for retirement, they maybe have already seen some of that decline. And so we're working off of, what are they spending now at 60? And I also think there is some replacement. Yes, kids cost less, but remember that you're oftentimes seeing really big increases in your health insurance premiums between 55 and 65.
Well, this is great. And this kind of goes right back to where I was hoping we could take this conversation. Andrew, I'm curious if you could jump off of that from the
Sure.
standpoint of where does some of that, I mean, because Robin's point is a good one, right? Like other expenses go up, presumably.
Yeah, Robin, to make a couple of points. Robin raises one very good point that bears on the sort of the technical side of all this research is, when do kids leave home? And some past research has tried to pinpoint a date to that. Is it when they move out, or do you assume that when they graduated from college? And it's very hard to pinpoint. In my more recent work, I've just simply used questions of parents of do you have economically dependent children? And that tries to get at the point of, it's not just when are they off the premises, but when, they sort of, off the clock. And that's an important thing in terms of thinking about it. I would suspect, it's the data side of this is difficult, but I would suspect that as you go towards higher and higher income households, the effect of children leaving is probably smaller. In the sense, high income households could have an annual income 10 or 20 times higher than a low income household. There's enormous differences, but yeah, if you're buying your kid a car, it's not going to be 10 or 20 times more expensive. Adding a room to the house isn't going to cost that much more, or their health insurance. So I suspect as you go to higher income, higher wealth households, these effects of kids entering and leaving are smaller. But in the middle, at the median, they're substantial. So it really is thinking, the evidence does indicate that, parents do, once kids leave home, they do work a little bit less, their earnings drop a little bit more. They do spend a little bit more on themselves, but by and large, they tend to they tend to save the money more. And this again goes to a technical issue. When you try to isolate precisely where they save that money, that's hard. If you're trying to look at, is it a 401k or an IRA contribution? Is it bank account? Is it paying off a debt, like paying off a mortgage? That stuff is very tough to isolate, in part because the data are small data sets, not great data quality. But in my more recent work, if we've defined saving as simply income minus spending, then you clearly see the increase in saving. But we also see the increase in net worth. If we ask people what their assets are, net worth tends to push up after kids have left home. So this is an issue I've been working on for more than 10 years. And there's different views of it, but I'm at a point now where I feel pretty confident in how this plays out, at least for a typical household.
Okay. And I think that's an important observation, right? At least for a typical household, because obviously there's heterogeneity here. But, I do think I just want to drill down just a little bit more on this idea of lifestyle maintenance that Robin raised. And because I think, Robin, I think your point that, well, how do I maintain a lifestyle if I don't know exactly what that is a really important one. And I'm going to just ask this to both of you and I'll see who wants to answer it. Do we see changes in what parents who are making that transition or have made that transition, do we see changes in terms of what they want to spend on? Vis-a-vis, like I could say, here's my lifestyle, but now the kids are gone. I'm going to actually increase my spending in this domain. Obviously the canonical cliche one would be travel. Do we see that sort of thing? Or do we see a lifestyle maintenance, general spending is the same on the categories I've had? Maybe, it stays around the same and then some of that money is left over. I don't know if that's something that you're able to observe in the data, Andrew or Robin, anecdotally. If either one of you want to speak to that, yeah.
In the data I've used, say travel and entertainment is a great example. You see two little humps in it when it shoots up. The first is when kids are young. You say we need to take them to Disneyland or whatever. The second is after they leave home and the parents like, let's take that around the world cruise or whatever that we owe ourselves after 25 years of this. You do find though after that it tends to decline. I mean, an interesting kind of follow-on of this is that household spending declines as kids leave home. It continues to decline throughout retirement for most households. So you see this bump right around retirement age, often with things like travel. But after that, that tends to fade out too. But as Robin said, something like health insurance costs are something that sort of increases kind of continuously throughout people's lifetimes.
That's great. Robin, anything to add on to that or?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that I don't, it's very hard for me to kind of to isolate the empty nesting because, people are going through retirement at the same time, but I would absolutely agree that, travel is certainly in leisure. I'm not surprised to hear that spikes up. I would say the spike is probably more correlated to retirement than it is to empty nesting.
I agree on that.
Okay. All right.
Well, you both have money and you have time, and one of these things that the money, time, and health tend to go together in terms of spending. So at retirement age, people have money, they suddenly have free time, and they also tend to be relatively healthy. As people grow older and their health declines a bit, spending falls because you don't want that round the world cruise anymore. So it's a very interesting and kind of complex interaction. But if you look in the data, you can see the patterns very clearly.
Okay. Let's maybe shift gears a little bit. I'd love to talk about the psychological side of this too. Andrew, is this something that you have looked at in the data at all or are familiar with in terms of like, what are some of the psychological outcomes that occur when adults make this transition to empty nesting?
Okay. Well, my psychological expertise is very limited, but I tend to look at these things in terms of how they play out with retirement outcomes, and we get the information from data. And I can give you this theoretical model that says, okay, kids are leaving home, parents are better off. Other people may disagree. One of the testable hypotheses is, if you're somebody who disagrees with me on this, then their theory is kids are bad for retirement security. If you have kids, they take away money, you can't save as much, so you're less secure in retirement. That's something we can test. And looking at data on retirees, of surveys of them, we have data not just on what your income and expenses are, but I also ask them these sort of subjective questions. How happy do you feel? How financially secure do you feel? Now, if having kids was bad for retirement security, then you'd say all other things equal, parents, people who had kids, would be less happy, less financially secure in retirement. That's just not the case. I mean, they're equally happy. Their self-reported financial security is the same as non-parents. It's really just not a big driver. I think, as kids leave home, you probably do feel that sort of postpartum depression or something. We've gone through this enormous thing. Now what? And so I suspect you would have those psychological effects as kids leave home. What do we do now? A new phase of our life. As people go into retirement, though, I think most of them are pretty settled, and by and large, they're very happy.
Okay. Robin, curious on your end, what have you noticed and how have your clients grappled with this? Because if I can just go back a second, now we are talking about a specific definition of empty nesting, right? So I appreciate on the economic side, it's not a binary outcome. It's not a toilet flush. It's gradual. But when the kids leave, when they move out, and I recognize that they can also move back, but when they make that move, what are you noticing with your clients?
Well, it's hard to say. I mean, it's all over. Everybody's an individual. I mean, I think there is sort of a little postpartum depression when there's no soccer game to go to and no hockey game to go to. I think people get over that pretty quickly. I think that I would even say that there's a little sigh of relief. And I know someone whose daughter's about to get her driving license. So that's step one in moving toward an empty nester. Like, it's a relief. I don't have to drive her everywhere. And the other thing I would say is very much depends. I see a lot of women going back to work. And so there's a little bit of relief that I can now focus maybe more on my career than on household duties. So, it can vary dramatically, I think, for everyone. But I think the big sigh of relief comes when they're off the payroll.
Okay. So that's a different sort of definition there. I get that. And by the way, I hear you, having spent almost all of Saturday at a very hot baseball field, I think I can anticipate missing it. And I can also anticipate not missing it. Well, let me ask you both this. Do you notice other identity shifts? And I'm agnostic who takes this one. Do you notice other identity shifts that get accelerated when the empty nester stage kicks in? Like, I could imagine a world in which now this actually makes me feel older. Andrew, I don't know if you can look at this sort of subjective age in the data set or not, or if anybody has. Robin, maybe you've seen this, or maybe it doesn't. Maybe it makes me feel younger because now I can go back to the world I lived in beforehand. Yeah.
If you look at happiness data, and yes, there is such a thing as happiness data, midlife seems to be the least happy time for most households. I mean, the midlife crisis is kind of a real thing. And it's difficult. You have financial pressures. You're still in the midst of your career, but you're starting to think about, raising your children. Okay, how do I get them through school, off to college? If you're upper middle class, at some point you're thinking a lot about your career, but then your focus is, okay, I got to get this kid into college. What do I have to do here? So there's enormous amount of pressure on people at that time of life. And I think, that there are downsides in the sense of, as you approach both the end of your working career, but also your kids leaving home, there's the potential for a loss of purpose of, okay, what do I do now? But if you look at the data on, what people say about their own satisfaction, people tend to get happier as they get older. And particularly in the US, we have a large jump in happiness as people shift from their working careers to retirement. There's a big increase in self-reported happiness at that point. So, I think you have a transition period, but it's not something that goes on forever for most people. People do just tend to get happier as they get older.
Yeah. Okay. And I'm familiar with some of this work. Of course, in grad school, I worked with Laura Carstensen, who's done a lot of this work on longitudinal outcomes and happiness. And I do think, the next question is going to be, what's the heterogeneity there? And what factors can lead us to predict one trajectory versus another one? Robin,
Well, I
let
can
me go
give
to
you
you.
the,
Sorry.
we just quickly give you there's sort of the good news. Most people get happier. The bad news is that part of the reason for this is what's known as survivorship bias, that happiness
Exactly.
is strongly correlated with health. And it's the people who are unhealthy, unhappy tend to die off, and you're left with a healthy and happy group.
Right.
So, different ways of looking at it.
I get that. Robin, let me go to you on that one.
I would tend to agree that most of our retirees seem very happy. They report, I don't know how I ever had time to go to work. Especially if they have interests and hobbies, I would not say I'm sensing that being an empty nester makes you feel older or a loss of purpose. I think that um, busy, engaged people stay busy and engaged when they're, even after their kids leave.
I love that perspective. All right, I'm gonna go with a couple quick rapid fire questions for you guys. So first off, practically speaking, any advice, and I know this is a tough question, but I'll try to keep it succinct. Any advice you would offer to people about to make that transition to becoming an empty nester? Robin, I'll go to you first, unless you want me to go to Andrew first, in which case.
In advice about, yeah, I guess I just am struggling with it's such a transition that happens over time.
Okay.
That I don't have any, specific advice other than, there's life after kids and it's actually great.
I honestly, I think that's good advice. The whole idea that you guys have surfaced about this being a gradual transition is really important. Andrew, I'll go to you.
Well, I think people do from the financial side. I would recommend think deliberately about it. Kids are very expensive. It's to raise one child up through high school graduation costs about $235,000. So to get two kids, double that, and then add college, it's an enormous amount of money. Once those kids are off the payroll, I wouldn't say you're going to be swimming in money, but you will find your household costs increase or decrease pretty significantly. You want to think what you want to do with that. And I think it's okay to reward yourself, job well done. On the other hand, this is also a time, if you're somebody who is concerned about having enough retirement savings, that 15 years or so from age 50 up to 65 is a time when you can really sock away a lot of money. So it's just, be conscious that this is going to happen and, be happy for it. But, be deliberate and think about how you want to deal with your newfound winnings.
That's great. Okay, last question for each of you. I'll start with you, Andrew. What, if anything, would you want the advisor side, the practice side, the practitioners to know about this particular topic? Anything that you would want that side of the equation to do differently based on the research that you've conducted and others have conducted in this space?
Okay, well, when I started, I said, if you look at media coverage of retirement savings issues, it's overwhelmingly negative. If you look at surveys, 60, 70% of people say, America faces a retirement crisis. And yet when surveys ask actual retirees, would you describe your financial situation as a crisis? Only about 5% of people say yes. Retirees are an overwhelmingly financially satisfied group. And so a lot of times advisors, they read the newspaper same as everybody else, and they think we have this crisis facing America. The answer is we don't. So looking at the patterns with children leaving home, that's a really good explanation for why we don't. It plays a really big role in enhancing retirement security, but it's often ignored in a lot of the research.
That's great. Okay, Robin, from your point of view, your side, is there anything you'd want the academics to know or study? We're always happy to take ideas for new projects.
Well, I think that the whole question of spending later in life is one that's of interest and something that I work with 6 or 7 financial planners, and we're doing planning projections for people, well into their 90s. And, we've seen the data. We have seen data from JP Morgan on spending later in life. And it does tell that story of declining spending. But I would like more data, more information on spending, post 70. Can we really confidently assume that people are going to spend less. So I would say more research in that area.
I think that's
We could
great.
have a
And
whole
also-
other episode on that.
Exactly. Well, and I was going to say, making projections based on current spending is always inherently problematic because today's 70-year-olds may not be the 70-year-olds of 20 years from now, right? So I think these are the things we have to uncover. Okay, let me stop there. This has been such an interesting conversation. Andrew, Robin, thank you both so much for spending your time with me and talking through these issues.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you.